Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the Stigma Crusher here. So unfortunately here in Canada where I live, we've had a terrible tragedy. This past weekend there was a street festival in Vancouver, one of our large cities on the west coast, and a young man plowed his car into the crowd, killing several people, injuring further. It's been a terrible tragedy. And the very first news report that I heard coming out of that tragedy was that this young man was known to mental health workers and the police, as though those two things were somehow related and significant. Now, the connection between mental illness and violence is definitely there, but not in the way that you think. So we know that people with mental illness are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than they are to be perpetrators of violent crime. We know that things that are associated with violence are being male, and yet we don't stigmatize the entire male gender, saying that they're all violent and that if you come across someone who is male, that you should be afraid for your life. And yet we have that connotation with regards to someone who's living with psychosis, for example, or bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychotic disorders. And it's absolutely infuriating. So what the news report said was that he was known to mental health care workers and the police, literally like in the same bubble. But that there was no reason to think about an involuntary commitment. There was no reason to think that he was violent based on the evaluations of the mental health professionals, which just goes to show that the violence wasn't related to the mental illness that he was struggling with. Violence was related to violence and aggression in this individual, but does that violence and aggression necessarily have to link to the mental illness that he was struggling with? Now, we haven't been given a diagnosis for this individual. We haven't been given any specifics, only, as I say, that he was known to mental health care workers in the area and the police. It's absolutely infuriating because as a person living with bipolar disorder, which can manifest itself with psychosis, as well as obviously severe crippling depression and crippling mania, I myself have lived with self-stigma that labeled myself as positively, potentially dangerous, because I know that the stigma that exists in my culture is that people with mental illness are potentially violent and dangerous and could, fly off the handle and do something violent at any time. And when I was a younger person, I lived with self-harm. I self-harmed on a regular basis, which only fueled my idea that potentially I was dangerous. If I was harming myself, might I harm others? And it was partly this fear that led me to hide my mental illness for so long, led me to not seek help when it could, we know early intervention benefits people living with mental illness. We know that the earlier you intervene, the better the outcomes are. And yet it was that stigma, that prejudice, that false idea that mental illness is linked with violence that caused me to not seek help for so long. And I fear that when other people living with mental illness see these reports, they see these reports in the news, known to mental health workers and police in the same breath, known like that the very first thing that reporters look for, that the society looks for, is, was this person mentally ill, because that might explain why they were violent. That other people are going to suffer longer than they should and not get the early care that they need because of this horrible, horrible stigma. And that is really all I wanted to reflect on today, is when you think of mental illness, forgive yourself if you think of violence, because our society really links mental illness to violence, and serious mental illness in particular to violence. Forgive yourself, but check yourself as well. Is a person sitting on the street corner speaking to themselves, apparently anyway, speaking to themselves, Is that a reason to cross to the other side because you just never know when that person might snap? And if so, potentially rethink that association of violence with mental illness. Again, we don't avoid all men because men are much more likely than women to perpetrate violent crimes. We don't stigmatize all men as being violent. We shouldn't stigmatize all people with mental illness as being violent either. Again, we're much more likely to be the victims of violent crime than we are to be the perpetrators. So, with that, I wish you a good week. Take care of yourselves. And if you're having conversations about violent crime, mass destruction, mass murder, gun violence, those kinds of things, and the first thing that the people you're talking to go to is, I wonder whether they had a history of mental illness, maybe open up that conversation. Talk about the association or the lack thereof between mental illness and violence and violent crime, and crush the stigma in that way. All right, take care of yourselves. Bye.
Stigma Crusher.